So this is the second part of the presentation on the aggregate expenditures model. So in this section, now we've introduced the model with just two levels of spending, consumer spending and investment spending. Now we're going to add the other two levels of spending, which relate to government spending and net export spending. Add those to the model, which completes the model. And then again, we'll talk about equilibrium GDP. But now we'll have the full model that we use to, again, visually show this relationship between the level of output in the economy, GDP, being equal to the four levels of spending. And then we'll talk about the equilibrium level of GDP in relation to the full employment level of GDP, which is the goal, and what happens when the equilibrium level falls short or actually surpasses that goal. So again, thus far we've added C and I. So let's go on and add another level of spending. We'll skip G for a moment and we'll go straight to XN, which is, again, is net export spending. That's spending on exports that we denote as X minus spending on imports that we denote as M. So XN is this net amount. And so, again, there are these obviously two components. So exports X represent goods that are produced here in the United States but are sold abroad. So money comes into the United States and the production leaves the country. This creates domestic production, therefore income and employment due to foreign spending on goods produced in the United States. Of course, imports are the opposite. Imports are goods that are purchased by US households or US businesses, and these goods are being produced abroad. So money flows out of the United States and these goods come into the United States. So imports reduce the sum of consumption and investment expenditures by however much is being spent on those imported goods. Because if we include in C and I, as we do, all goods and services produced, then we had to deduct from that amount, well, how many of those goods and services were produced abroad. So we subtract that figure so we don't overstate aggregate expenditure on US produced goods and services only. So therefore we have this net measure of net export spending, X minus M. And because it's a net measure, it can be positive or negative. So here we have the net export schedule, and it shows two different scenarios at different levels of GDP in column 1 there. In the second column we have a positive net export spending where spending on exports exceeds spending on imports by $5 billion. And in the third column, net export spending is negative. So spending on exports is less than spending on imports, again by $5 billion. So the net export spending amount, again, can be positive or negative. And again, it's all about the relationship between the amount of money spent on exports and the amount of money spent on imports. So if we look at those two scenarios, back to our diagram, so on the top there we have the level of net export spending in billions graphed against different levels of real GDP. And we can see that top red line represents when we have a positive net export spending amount. And it's a positive $5 billion. And the second red line here, XN2, represents negative export spending. So in both cases you can see with positive net export spending and negative, it's either always $5 billion, again independent of the real GDP, or it's negative $5 billion, again independent real GDP. So when we add these net export spending levels to our model, so again right now here we are back to the aggregate expenditures diagram where we have this lighter blue line we're currently at. Again, right now this represents C plus I. Here will be our equilibrium level of GDP, $470 billion right now, spending 470, so we're producing $470 billion worth of goods and services. So if we add positive net export spending of $5 billion, so what does that do to our spending line? If we add that positive $5 billion, it just shifts up the spending line by $5 billion. And when spending rises, we move to this higher spending line and GDP rises. Note the $5 billion increase in spending, net export spending, increased GDP by 20 billion. If instead we had this scenario with a negative $5 billion net export spending amount, again back to our original C plus I spending line, if we add in this negative spending amount, that would shift down the spending line to this bottom one. Again, this is now C plus I plus this XN2, which is negative $5 billion net export spending. The spending line shifts down by those $5 billion, and our new equilibrium would be a point right here, $450 billion in real GDP. So again, if we add a positive amount, the spending line shifts up, which increases real GDP. If we add in this negative net export spending amount, the spending line would shift down to show a decrease in spending, and therefore, correspondingly, the real GDP amount would also fall. If we look at net exports of goods across nations, this is from 2012, we'll see that some nations here, such as Germany, China, France, have a positive net export spending. So these countries at the top have more money spent on their exports than they spend on imports. And we have other countries such as Japan, the UK, and the US, which have a negative net export spending. So they're bringing in more imports than they are exporting. And you can see for the US, that's a significant number, about $750 billion in negative net export spending. About $750 billion spent more on imports than exports. So thinking about net export spending, exports and imports, thinking about these international economic linkages, the link between different nations buying and selling goods from each other. Thinking in terms of the US, if there's more prosperity abroad, so other nations are doing well economically, that can increase US exports because the wealth generated abroad leads to additional spending on goods from other countries such as the US. So in that sense, when other nations are prospering economically, we can see a transfer of some of that prosperity to nations like the United States. Of course, therefore, conversely, if other nations are struggling, perhaps going into a recession, then this can have the adverse effect. As they cut spending, they'll be cutting spending on goods and services produced abroad, such as goods and services from the United States. So that would have a weakening effect on the US economy. So, of course, when thinking about exports and imports, exchange rates are important. How much it costs one to transfer a currency to another one. And so you may have heard of the terms depreciation and appreciation of a currency such as the US dollar. So what depreciation of the US dollar does, there's two effects. It makes goods produced in the US cheaper to those abroad, which encourages foreign countries to buy more goods produced in the United States. So it increases exports out of the United States. At the same time, goods produced abroad become more expensive to those in the US. So that discourages imports into the United States. Both of those effects have a positive effect on net export spending. Exports rise, imports fall. So that improves US economic conditions. So what I mean by that is this could lead to higher real GDP depending on the current level of GDP, that may or may not cause inflation, but generally an increase in net export spending will increase real GDP in the United States. The opposite impact would be felt with the appreciation of the US dollar. When the dollar strengthens or appreciates, US goods become more expensive to those abroad, so US exports go down. At the same time, goods abroad become cheaper if purchased here in the United States. Goods produced abroad become cheaper in the United States, so imports will increase. So those two effects, export spending going down, import spending going up, reduce net export spending, and therefore would lead to a fall in real GDP in the United States. One quick caution: sometimes at this point texts and even microeconomic text would talk about barriers to trade, talk about tariffs or quotas. These are two different ways to basically influence the net export spending amount. A tariff is basically a tax on the imported goods. So a good produced abroad that's coming into the United States will be taxed to make it relatively more expensive, to encourage the domestic consumer to purchase the good that was produced in the United States, which is now relatively cheaper. That is one potential option, but there's definitely some cautions with things like tariffs. For example, the other country might retaliate and put a tariff on US exports, which would actually reduce GDP for both countries. So basic principle of microeconomics text was free trade is mutually beneficial. So getting rid of tariffs and quotas and making trade free between two nations would increase GDP for both nations. So that's adding X. We just go ahead and we add the net export spending level to the model, which only leaves us with one more, only leaves us with G. And again, G is government spending or government purchases. So when the government spends money on building new roads or providing a library or spending on the military, that's all considered G, government spending. And so we need to add that level of spending to the model. So let's say right now government spending is $20 billion. So what would that do? Well, that's an increase in spending. So when we add that to the model, we'll see the spending line shift up by $20 billion. We know that will increase real GDP, because again, real GDP is a function of the four levels of spending. So if spending increases, production must increase too. But again, by how much is what we're interested in. Again, you've got to remember the multiplier effect. Without the multiplier, we can't continue. So we include the multiplier. Let's say the multiplier has a value of 4. So this extra level of spending, there's $20 billion in government spending, multiplied by 4 would create an $80 billion change, or increase in this case, in real GDP. That assumes at this point that that extra government spending is not financed by taxes, because that would change the situation. We'll look at taxes in a few moments. But a straight increase of government spending of $20 billion with a multiplier of 4 would increase real GDP by $80 billion. So here we have the completed table. This table shows in column 1 here our variable of interest, real GDP, increasing as we move down. And we have our 4 levels of spending. C, here's I, over here, column 6, G, and then in column 5 we have the 2 levels of spending, X and M, so we have net export spending. Notice export spending is 10 billion, import spending is 10 billion, so net export spending is just 0, so nothing to do with XN. Exports and imports just cancel each other out. So we take C and we add I, 20 billion, and we add G, 20 billion. So we take C and add 40 billion to get C plus I plus G plus XN, which is our last column here. Again, this is aggregate expenditures, the 4 levels of spending added together. And again, we're looking for the point, the one point where over here, the level of spending is exactly equal to real GDP. We know the equilibrium will be pushed to that point. We have to go to the very bottom line here, and we see in this 10th row, when real GDP is $550 billion, spending is $550 billion. Spending is equal to real GDP at this one point and only this point. So this blue highlighted row here, this will be our equilibrium. To see this graphically, again, here we were in this middle spending line with C, I, and XN. Then we added G. Again, G was this extra 20 billion, so the spending line shifted up by $20 billion. We were at an equilibrium here of 470 billion in terms of real GDP. The extra $20 billion in spending, again, multiplied by the multiplier value of 4, therefore increased real GDP by 20 times 4, which is 80. So our new equilibrium would be $550 billion, $80 billion more than the previous one. So again, this upward shift in the spending line is from the addition of government spending, causing the increase in real GDP. And again, to quantify that effect, you have to know the multiplier. It's the multiplier that's telling us, due to this increase in government spending, how much more real GDP will be created in the economy. So that analysis assumed that the $20 billion government spending wasn't financed through taxation. But if the government goes out and spends $20 billion, that money's got to come from somewhere. So what if we assume the government finances that $20 billion in spending by providing a $20 billion lump sum tax, so one-time tax? What would happen? So how do we deal with taxes here? Well, how do taxes work? What's the progression? How taxes affect the economy, or how taxes affect spending? Well, if it's a $20 billion lump sum tax, then the government's taxing all households a little bit more to collectively raise this $20 billion. So incomes across the United States are going to fall by that $20 billion. The government's taking a bit of tax away from everybody else through income tax. Collectively, that generates $20 billion in tax revenues to the government. So incomes in the United States, income is falling by $20 billion. So then what happens? Well, we've talked about that relationship because income is very important in terms of determining consumer spending. If income in the United States goes down, then we assume consumer spending will go down. As we have less money, as we earn less money, we'll spend less. But then the big question is, well, how much less? Would it be 20 billion? If incomes across the United States fall by 20 billion, would we expect to see a 20 billion decrease in consumer spending? Well, no. No, we wouldn't, because remember, that relationship, the relationship between a change in income and a change in consumer spending, is all about the MPC. The MPC translates that change in income to a change in spending. If we assume an MPC of 0.75, so again, what does that mean? That means given any change in income, consumer spending, C, will fall by or change by 75% of that. So if incomes are falling by 20 billion and consumer spending will fall by 75% of that, consumer spending will fall by 15 billion. And that's what's going to impact the economy. Because again, it's the change in spending that's going to drive the change in GDP. So if consumer spending is now falling by $15 billion, then what happens to GDP? We know it goes down, but by how much? Again, we don't know unless we know the multiplier. It's the multiplier that translates the change in spending into the eventual change in GDP. The multiplier, again, if the MPC is 0.75, the multiplier will have a value of 4. Remember, 1 divided by 1 minus the MPC. So the $15 billion decrease in consumer spending multiplied by 4 would create a $60 billion decrease in GDP. So if that increase in government spending was financed by a lump sum tax, then the effect of that tax would actually reduce real GDP. So, back to our table, if now we consider the effect of this lump sum tax of $20 billion, and we deduct the 20 billion from the original level of income here, so 370, take the $20 billion off, gives us this $350 billion in disposable income. Again, this is reducing these consumer spending levels. So now take the new levels of C. Again, we add I, we add G, and XN is 0. We get our new aggregate spending levels. These have now fallen because consumer spending has gone down. Again, though, we're looking for, well, what's the new equilibrium level of GDP? Where does spending equal real GDP? And I can see it right here. When GDP is 490 billion, spending is 490 billion. That's our new GDP level. Remember, it was 550. It's gone down by that 60 billion that we just talked about. The $15 billion decrease in C because of the lump sum tax times 4 reduced real GDP by 60 billion. And we move from this point, 550 billion, down to 490 billion, and there's the $60 billion decrease in real GDP. Again, graphically, here's how we see this. Here was our spending line right here at the top, C plus I plus G plus XN. Now we assume that lump sum tax of 20 billion, reducing C by 15 billion. Again, this downward shift of the spending line shows that. This is a $15 billion decrease in spending, C in particular. And that moves us from our old equilibrium to a new one. And again, that's that $60 billion decrease in real GDP. So, that's the model complete. That's how it works. The aggregate expenditures model shows us aggregate expenditures line, C plus I plus G plus XN. Based on that current level of spending, we can see the current level of GDP, the equilibrium level of GDP. So it's this visual, graphical representation of that relationship, how the current level of GDP is a function of those 4 levels of spending. Now, the next step in this process is therefore to say, okay, well now we can calculate the equilibrium level of GDP. What is the level of GDP that we would like to be producing at? Remember, we call that the full employment level of GDP. When all our current resources are fully employed, how much GDP can this economy produce? That's where we want to be. Again, we call it the full employment level of GDP, or just full employment. That's the goal. So, when we calculate the equilibrium level of GDP, you can probably imagine it's unlikely to be at the full employment level. The equilibrium level of GDP might be short of the full employment level. You actually might surpass the full employment level. You can produce more than full employment. We'll see later when we do the aggregate demand aggregate supply diagram perhaps why you wouldn't want to do that. But for right now, if full employment level of GDP is the goal for the economy, then once we find the equilibrium level of GDP, we're going to expect that it will be either below or above that full employment level. It might be right there, and if it is, that's great. But what if it's not? So what if equilibrium level of GDP is not at full employment? So there's obviously 2 possibilities. You might be below or above full employment. So let's go through scenario A, where equilibrium GDP is below full employment. So right now, based on the level of spending in the economy, you're not producing as much GDP as you would like, as the economy could. So the level of spending is insufficient right now to get firms to produce the level of GDP that we would consider full employment. So here's our aggregate expenditures model again. And what we see here are two spending lines, AE0 and AE1. So what's the difference? Well, let's say AE1, the lower of the two spending lines, represents the current level of spending in the US economy. Therefore, the current level of GDP will be where that spending line crosses the 45-degree line, right here, $490 billion. So right now, in the US economy, based on the current level of spending, the economy is producing $490 billion worth of GDP. But we see you have the second spending line, this higher one, which represents the level of spending, AE0, the level of spending that would be required to get to this equilibrium here, which would put the economy at full employment. We know that if this economy is fully utilizing its resources, it can produce $510 billion worth of GDP. Let's say we just know that's the full employment level. So I therefore know we need to be spending this amount of money. We need to be along this spending line to get to this equilibrium to put the economy right here at full employment. But again, we're not. We're on this lower spending line, putting the economy here. So what do we have? We are $20 billion below the full employment level of GDP. The current equilibrium level of GDP is $490 billion. The full employment level is $510 billion. So we're $20 billion short in terms of GDP. We call this scenario a recessionary gap situation, because when you are below full employment in terms of GDP, it's akin to being in a recession. We might not be in a recession here, but a recession is when you produce less than the full employment level of output. This has to go on for 6 months, and we'll talk about that later, but this is akin to being in a recession. So when the current level of spending is below what is required to put the economy at full employment, we call that a recessionary expenditure gap. And what the recessionary gap looks at is not this distance here. This is how we know that we're in a recessionary gap situation where the current level of GDP is below full employment. The recessionary gap looks at the two spending lines and asks the question, how much more do we have to spend in the economy to put us at full employment? So again, here's our current spending line, and here's the spending line we want to be on, this one right here. So what's this vertical distance right here between the two spending lines? So we have to calculate that. Well, again, going with this multiplier value of 4, if we are $20 billion short of full employment GDP, so I want GDP to increase by $20 billion, how much more does the economy have to spend? So in this case, we sort of have to work backwards. In this scenario, I know this change in GDP. I want to calculate what the change in spending will be to generate that change in GDP. Again, any change in spending, the change in GDP will be 4 times that amount when the multiplier is 4. So if I want to increase real GDP by $20 billion, I need to increase spending by $5 billion, because the increase of $5 billion spending times 4 would give us the increase of $20 billion in real GDP. So if you know how much you want to change GDP by, take that, divide it by the multiplier, and that will tell you how much spending has to change to derive that change in real GDP. And again, so here we would say the recessionary expenditure gap is $5 billion. We need spending to rise by $5 billion to get GDP to increase by $20 billion, 4 times that amount, to get rid of the recessionary gap. So, there's some notes just behind that. So the full employment level of GDP is $510 billion. To get there, though, the economy has to be spending on that AE1 spending line. However, currently we're only along the AE0 spending line. So the economy is below full employment. Again, we call this a recessionary gap, as the current level of equilibrium GDP is below the full employment level. Again, when output is below the full employment level, it's like being in a recession. You might not technically be in a recession, but you can think of it that way. So again, what is the value of the recessionary gap? How much do we need to increase spending by to get the economy to full employment? Again, you have to know the multiplier. In this case, the multiplier is 4, so we need to increase spending by $5 billion, because the $5 billion increase in spending would then hit the multiplier of 4, would create a $20 billion increase in real GDP, and that would put the economy at full employment. So the big question is, well, how can we get spending to rise by $5 billion? Well, we'll talk a little bit at the end of this presentation about Keynesian economics versus the classical thinking, but there's a British economist by the name of John Maynard Keynes, who, this was early part of the 20th century, early 1900s, suggested 2 different policies that the government can use to close this recessionary gap and help the economy achieve full employment. So Keynesian economics is very much about the government stepping in and trying to help the economy out when it's not achieving its full employment potential. And so if we want to get spending in the economy to rise by $5 billion, then Keynes suggested 2 different policies to do that. One is just a direct policy. If we want spending to increase, if the government wants spending to increase by $5 billion, well, the government can just go ahead and increase spending by $5 billion. Remember, G is one of our 4 levels of spending. It is the government, so the government can go ahead and just spend more money in the economy. The second potential would be to lower taxes. So we looked already about how taxes work. If you lower taxes, that would increase income, that would increase consumer spending. So again, we could use taxes to try and encourage households to spend more money. So those are the 2 different ways. So let's look at both of them in turn. So again, the first one is a direct method. If we want spending in the economy to go up by $5 billion, then the government can go straight in and the government can increase spending by $5 billion. Spend more money on the military, spend more money on building roads, etc. That direct increase G of $5 billion would then have the required effect. It would shift up the spending line by $5 billion, and that again would increase GDP by 4 times that amount. So we'd move from our current equilibrium to the new one, which again is exactly where we want to be. So the increase of G of $5 billion would get us out of this recessionary gap situation. The second method is slightly more involved, because now again we're thinking about taxes. So again, if we want to increase spending, Keynesian economics would advocate lowering taxes. Because as we lower taxes, that increases disposable income, take-home pay, and then we spend more money. So consumer spending should go up when taxes go down. If we accept that progression, the big question is, well then, how much do I have to lower taxes by? If I want to get spending, consumer spending, to rise by $5 billion, how much do I need to decrease taxes by? Well, we need, in this case, kind of work backwards to calculate this. So, to get consumer spending to go up by $5 billion, we have to increase disposable income. But again, by how much? How much do we need to increase people's income by to make them go and spend an extra $5 billion? Again, that relationship is all about the MPC. Again, we'll use an MPC of 0.75. So again, given any change in income, consumer spending would change by 75% of that. So what is $5 billion, 75% of. It's 75% of $6.67 billion. If we could increase income by $6.67 billion, consumer spending would rise by 75% of that, $5 billion, which is how much we want consumer spending to rise by. So, to get disposable income to go up by $6.67 billion, we need to cut taxes by that amount. We need to cut taxes a little bit from everybody, giving everybody a bit more disposable income. Collectively across the United States, we need to give people an extra $6.67 billion in disposable income. They'll go ahead and spend 75% of that if the NPC is 0.75, which would cause this $5 billion increase in consumer spending. That would shift up the spending line and again increase real GDP by the requisite amount, the $20 billion increase that we're looking for. So, with a recessionary gap situation, the current level of GDP is below full employment. So again, what we need to do in that situation is increase spending and do that by increasing G or cutting taxes. It could also be, however, that the current level of GDP actually surpasses full employment, which at first sounds great. You're producing more than the full employment level, which therefore corresponds to more employment and more income. However, the problem with producing beyond the full employment level, this is when inflationary pressures tend to kick in. And inflation is something that you really don't want to have to deal with. We'll see more about this in our next model with the aggregate demand, aggregate supply diagram. But basically, when too much money is being spent in the economy, this is when prices start to rise. And when inflation kicks in, it's tricky to get rid of, so you really don't want to get to that point where you're producing too much, so inflation starts to be a problem in the economy. So, but again, we have a problem. In this case, we're producing more than is ideal. And so we have an inflationary gap situation. And for an inflationary gap, when we're spending too much money, the question becomes, well, how much do we need to decrease spending in the economy by to get the economy back to full employment? So just as some notation, QF is often what I use to denote full employment. The F for full employment, Q is the quantity level, so it's the full employment level of real GDP. I sometimes abbreviate to QF. Let's say now I'll change the NPC just to change things up a bit. We have an NPC of 0.5. So we need to calculate the value of the inflationary gap. First of all, we've got to know what the multiplier is. So you quickly plug it into the multiplier formula. Remember, the multiplier is equal to 1 divided by 1 minus the NPC. Well, obviously 1 minus 0.5 is still 0.5. 0.5 goes into 1 2 times. So the multiplier here will be 2. Again, let's say GDP, the current level of GDP, in this case is $20 billion more than full employment. So the current level of GDP is $20 billion more than ideally we would like it to be. Again, we got to that point because the economy was spending too much money. So how much do we need to decrease spending by to decrease GDP by $20 billion? Again, to know that, you've got to utilize the multiplier. Any change in spending, the change in GDP will be twice as big when the multiplier is 2. So if I want GDP to fall by $20 billion, take that divided by 2 tells me that I need spending to fall by 10 billion. Half that amount. Again, the 10 billion fall in spending will cause GDP to fall by a multiple of 2, so $20 billion. So again, here are our spending lines. Again, if the top spending line here, AE2, represents the current spending line, so here we are producing $530 billion worth of GDP. AE0 represents the spending required to put us at full employment. We're producing $20 billion too much in the economy, so we need spending to fall. If the multiplier is 2, I need spending to fall by $10 billion. And that's the value of the inflationary gap, or the inflationary expenditure gap. How much we need to reduce spending by to get the current level of GDP back down to full employment. Just like with a recessionary gap situation, with an inflationary gap, there's 2 ways we can do this. If I need spending to fall by $10 billion, we can either directly decrease G by that amount, get the government to cut spending by $10 billion, or increase taxes. Again, increasing taxes is the more difficult of the scenarios because you have to work through how taxes affect disposable income and how that changes C. Again, you really need to work backwards there. In this case, I know I need consumer spending to fall by 10 billion. MPC is 0.5, therefore I should be able to work back and say, if I need spending to fall by 10 billion, I need disposable income to fall by 20. Again, with the MPC of 0.5, the change in spending will be 0.5 of any change in disposable income. If I can get disposable income to fall by $20 billion, spending from households would fall by half that amount, 10 billion. So therefore I need taxes to be increased by 20 billion. So those are the 2 ways of closing the inflationary gap. So, thinking about this model and thinking about what we talked about, seems an applicable time to talk a little about the Great Recession, the big recession we've just been through, 2007 to 2009. And so it began very late in 2007. So what happened in the Great Recession? Well, real GDP fell significantly, as we've seen previously with our slide showing the depth and the intensity and the duration of the last Great Recession. And unemployment jumped above 10%. The 10% level of unemployment for an economy like the United States is significantly high. So what caused all this? Well, as we understand it, GDP is a function of levels of spending. So GDP declined so significantly. And what caused that? Well, consumer spending fell. Investment spending also fell significantly. So we had this large recessionary expenditure gap. The level of spending in the economy was well below what it needed to be to put the economy at full employment. So consumer spending fell significantly, investment spending fell significantly, so that spending line was well below what was required to put the economy at full employment. Again, we call that a recessionary expenditure gap. So what did the US government do to try and get out of this recession? They undertook some Keynesian policies, and again with Keynesian economics, the general idea is when the economy is producing below or above full employment level GDP, they would advocate the government to get involved to try and help put the economy back at the full employment level. So in this situation, when we're suffering from a deep recession, you want to, again, generate more spending in the economy, increase aggregate expenditures, shift up that spending line, increase real GDP, and eliminate that recessionary expenditure gap and bring the economy back to full employment GDP. So how did the government try and do that? Well, one thing was that they sent out tax rebate checks. So households across America all got a tax rebate. Basically, a one-time tax cut, which increases your disposable income, as we've discussed, therefore encouraging people to spend more money, encouraging households to go out and buy more consumer goods and services to boost the economy. That didn't have much of an effect, unfortunately, because it seems that most people, when they got these tax rebate checks, just kept them in the bank, worried perhaps about the recession and will I have my job in the next, in 6 months from now? So I'm not going to spend that money. I'm going to save it. But of course, if you save it and not spending, then that doesn't boost aggregate expenditures. Something else was called the stimulus package. They just pumped lots of money, $787 billion into the economy. Again, the ideas here are to stimulate spending, increase spending, and try and increase real GDP. So it seems maybe at this point I should really just identify, scratch the surface a little bit about these two sides of macroeconomic policy, where we had the long-standing classical view and the more recent, although been around now for several decades, Keynesian view. And so classical economics developed really going back to Adam Smith. Adam Smith wrote his book on the Wealth of Nations, really believed that a market system would ensure full employment of the economy, except for maybe some temporary short-term deviations. And until the 1930s in America, that was the commonly accepted belief, because the economy generally was at full employment. Now and again would slip into a period of recession or perhaps inflation, but would move back to full employment. So these deviations were relatively short, but also were self-correcting. Therefore, there was no need for the government to get involved. The economy would correct itself. So why do they think that the economy would correct itself? Well, essentially they think that prices and wages are flexible. And so if there's a decrease in output in the economy, so think of that moving into recession, therefore a decrease in employment, then prices would fall. And prices would fall because firms would want to increase production again. So one way to stimulate spending is to lower prices. Now households start to spend money again as prices fall, quantity demanded rises, and then output would increase again, moving us back towards full employment. Also, wages are flexible, so wages would go down, and again that would help increase employment. So this flexibility in prices and wages would help self-correct the economy. The Keynesian idea, though, is different. And so it was really the Great Depression where the Keynesian idea started to get some foothold. Because what happened in the Great Depression? Well, in the 1930s, GDP in the United States fell by 40%. And that is a huge decrease in real GDP. Unemployment, therefore, rose, of course, and rose to 25%. So an incredibly high unemployment rate. Also, the Great Depression lasted for several years. And this seemed to refute the classical thinking that the markets would be self-correcting and push us back to full employment when GDP fell so much and stayed below full employment for so long. So at this point, again, John Maynard Keynes, the British economist, his idea really provided a platform to a different way of thinking to the classical theory. And so Keynes suggested that not all income is always spent. And so when output falls below full employment, so we start moving into the recession, rather than prices being flexible and falling to increase spending again, firms may just reduce output. So we're not going to see this rebound in the economy. So a recession or a depression could follow this initial decline in employment and income. So the aggregate expenditures model that we've developed is really based on the Keynesian thinking, or at least the ideas that come from Keynes and the Keynesian thinking. And so, again, it's based on this idea that saving and investment decisions may not be coordinated. And also, prices and wages are not as flexible in a downward direction as maybe the classical thinking would suggest. So internal market forces can cause depressions, and if that's the case, and if the economy is not going to naturally return itself back to full employment, the government should play an active role in stabilizing the economy. So that's what we were talking about when we're looking at recessionary, inflationary gaps. If the economy was spending too low a level, the government can step in and try and help it out. If we're spending too much in the economy, the government can step in and try and help it out. And again, the aggregate expenditures model helps us understand that process.